So, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jason Conner. Dr. Conner's career is focused on research on and applications for innovative, flexible, and adaptive clinical trial design. He's currently a director and senior statistical scientist at Barrett Consultants, the world leader in innovative trial designs. I got to know Jason as part of the Adaptive project, where we developed 4 or 5 innovative clinical trial designs in a collaboration between NINDS and Barrett Consultants and MUSC. That's both the Michigan, the Clinical Coordinating Center, and the MUSC, the Statistical Data Management Center of NET. And one of those trials, ESET, is actually up and enrolling. And if anybody in this room goes into status epilepticus, you'll go into ESET. If we don't manage to stop it with mental activities. So, do you have bracelets? If anybody wants to opt out, we don't have any bracelets. So I would hope, though, if you're this course, you would know that. There's more information about Jason in the program, but I will, without further ado, hand it over to him.
Oh, like many people that look much shorter on blue jeans. So this is working. Volume in the back. Okay. All right. So thank you. I thought I was talking about something else, and then I looked at Sam's agenda the other day. I'm like, oh my god, that's not what I thought I was. This looks rushed. It's my fault, not McLaughlin and Christy Broglio, who I've now totally stole this off from. So I'm talking about dose finding, and so that I have a bunch of so there's a bunch of slides here, and dose finding tends to, the traditional drug development tends to have 3 phases, right? Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 1 tends to be identifying how much drug can we give you, what is the maximum tolerated dose. We've seen lots of these in cancer, though the most recent trial like this, Roger and I were involved on the DMC floor, was a degenerative neurologic disease. So I have slides on this. That's what I thought I was talking about. So they're in the back. If anyone wants to learn about that, I'm not going to talk to them, but since the slides are downloadable, you can look through and learn about 3+3 design and CRM design. We will be talking about phase 2, which is we have maybe some idea of the dose range. We don't know if the drug is effective in the target disease we're talking about, but the question is, well, can we get some additional evidence that it is effective? And if so, what is the optimal dose? What is the optimal target population to take forward to phase 3? And then phase 3 trials are what may make the news more, maybe not what all of us do. But the idea is we have 1 dose or a limited number of doses, and we really want to confirm the clinical benefit in the target population. And ideally, at the end of phase 3, we would come away with a label or a drug. So briefly, I won't go into this in detail, but phase 1 trials, we often see 3+3 designs. These are probably the most common. They're super easy to implement. With one flow chart, it's in the back of the slides. You can implement these yourself. You don't need a statistician. A lot of people probably know where it stands. 3+3, since you don't actually need a statistician to run them. Probably like the easier without one. But one of the faults, I think, is that they don't incorporate the totality of the data. And as a statistician, that's one of the key things that I always want to do. I want to incorporate all my data in that. So to do that, there's a newer, better method called continuum reassessment method. It's model-based, uses the totality of the information, and there are many papers that illustrate that you're more likely to choose the dose you want to choose, the target dose, than with 3+3 designs. So like I said, the slides, which I won't go over at the end of this presentation, for anyone who down. What we will talk about today is phase 2 trials, which is really when we start looking at efficacy. So phase 1 tends to focus on safety. How much drug can I give someone still in a safe range? And phase 2 is when we start really wanting to quantify the dose response curve with respect to efficacy. So there's a lot of other things to consider in phase 2, and Mike Tram's really hit on a bunch of these last night. What is the actual target population? In the TPA trials, many of those initial trials failed because they enrolled patients who had strokes 6 hours ago or even longer, whereas it took a long time and numerous failed trials to realize that maybe TPA only works if we get within 3 hours, or even better within 90 minutes. A lot of treatments now in AIDS and cancer and other places work with combinations of treatments better than one drug alone. So if we're thinking about dose finding, we need to think about dose finding over a combination of drugs, which gets multidimensional very rapidly. And it's really hard to do fixed trials over all of those possibilities. So is there a way to come up with a system that allows us to take this multidimensional space of different drugs, or different indications, or in case, different times for onset of stroke, to focus down on what is the best dose to take forward? Currently, we tend to pick, a couple of doses, a limited number of doses or durations or combinations, and explore those. And there's probably better ways to do that. And we'll walk through kind of simplified versions of some of these. So in order to do this, we'll consider the idea of learning as we go, right? Like, so we probably all played this game of like you hide something for your 4-year-old, right? And you tell them they're getting warmer or getting colder. We all play this game. But so if your kid is walking towards the pillow under the couch where you hid this, and you go getting warmer, and they randomly walk in some direction, you're really upset and you're disappointed that your kid isn't smarter than you. But that's how we do dose finding drugs, is that even as evidence accumulates, oftentimes we just continue to equally randomize things across doses. Doses that are too small to be effective, to doses that are too high to be tolerable, unless there's sometimes overwhelming evidence that a DMC shuts one of these doses down. We keep equally randomizing things. So, next time you're designing a dose finding trial, you can think about how you would want your 4-year-old to play the hotter colder game and maybe implement some of those very basic ideas in your dose finding trial. But the idea is to learn as we go, and where it looks like the action is, with the data saying you're getting hotter, keep going in that direction and keep exploring that. And maybe you'll start getting colder because you're going to the wrong side of the couch, but the data will tell you, and you'll end up, still searching around the right space. And we'll explore some of those ideas. But by the end of that, the idea is in dose finding trials, by the end of that, when you're using the data to guide where you look, by the end of the trial, you're getting data on doses that matter, and you're assigning patients the strategies that's most likely to help them. So it's good for you as a trial is getting information, and it's obviously good for the patient who's more likely to get it that benefits them and where it's tolerable. Okay, so this is an example of such a trial. So I'm going to build up from kind of basic to more advanced with 3 different levels of complexity here. So I'm going to assume that in phase 1 we've identified a maximum tolerated dose. So we know kind of the upper bounds of safety for the drug. And now we want to use a larger number of patients to start to quantify the dose-response relationship with respect to efficacy. So there's many parts of this we may want to understand. So the idea of what is the totality of the dose-response curve, or we may just want to know what is the minimally effective dose, what is the maximally efficacious dose, what is the 80-90, and I'll illustrate what those 3 things mean for anyone who may not have seen this before. So we may just want to offer some benefit to patients over placebo. So we may say, what is the smallest dose that would give me, say, a 35% relative response to placebo? So we can try to estimate our dose response curve, but really focus on, okay, what dose gives me that 35% benefit versus placebo? So here that may be around 35 or 36 milligrams. If I had something with, say, a non-monotonic dose response curve, I may want to identify what dose gives me the maximum response. So in this case, we would try to estimate where this peaks, and it seems like somewhere around 70 milligrams, I get my maximum response of 60%. Or if I have something that is a monotonic curve, well, this curve keeps going up little by little, but we probably don't need to give this much drug when, this much drug is getting almost the same amount of benefit. Or we hear about 80-90s, 80-95s, and what that is, we try to estimate where this asymptotes. And so the 80-90 is what dose gives me 90% of that effect. So in this case, that's about a 50 milligram dose. So the idea there is that this attempts, to, in some light fashion, identify, well, what dose can I give you that almost gets to the maximum dose, but you can see that if I think of around here, maybe really leveling out, I can get away with giving someone 20 milligrams less. I get almost all the benefit, and ideally I get way fewer toxicity or tolerability issues. So when we're we're designing our trial, we have to think about what we want to know. Do we want to know the MED? Do we want to know the ED90? Maybe we want to know both of those things, and we can use some of these methods to identify both of those. Feel free to stop me at any time with questions. So an example here, so imagine we're designing a trial in stroke with a dichotomous outcome like an MRS. And so my outcome is, and I don't think this is necessarily the best outcome, but I'll use this for the example, can we get an MRS 0, 1, or 2 after stroke? So I have your responder, if you're 0, 1, or 2, or you're a non-responder, if you're 3, 4, 5, or 6. And I can ask, what is the maximally effective dose over a range of doses? And I think that a key thing is to always step back and ask, what do we really want to know here? And really the goal, right, in any phase 2 trial is to learn the most that we can so we design a successful phase 3 trial. That we want to identify maybe not just the maximally effective dose, but we want to know tolerability issues, we want to know what dose is most likely to give me success in phase 3. So here imagine, Chris Coffey earlier this morning said, every trial can have 90% power to see something. And so many times, I design a trial. Now I ask people, well, what's the maximum subjects you can get? Because when a statistician doesn't ask that, we just do a power calculation. And we say, 4,300, then people laugh at us. And I feel bad when people laugh at me. So now I also say, well, how many patients can you get? And start from there sometimes, because we all realize we live in a world of resource constraints. So let's imagine here that we have resources for 280 patients in the time phase 2 allows, and I'll work from there. So the simplest design, so imagine we have, say, 7 doses. A lot of times, like I said, people start out with a really small number of doses, but if we're in phase 2, we don't know that a drug works. We certainly don't know which of those works the best. I gave a talk a few years ago, and a few of us were given an example with 1 dose and 1 drug. It was supposed to be a phase 2, or one dose of placebo. It was supposed to be a phase 2 trial. And I said, if this actually happened in real life, and the 3 of us kind of competed to see which design was. And I said, if this happened in real life, I would back up and say, how do you know this is the right dose, right? This is a phase 2 trial. You're giving me 1 dose and telling me to compare it to placebo. If it's phase 2, we don't know the drug works. How do we possibly know this is the right dose? So I would really push to expand the dose range. And the discussant got up afterwards, who I didn't know well at the time of analogy too, and I really liked her at the time. She said, I thought it was fascinating. And the first thing Jason said was, how can we make this problem more complicated? And I wanted to push her aside and say, did everyone hear the absurd things she just said? But now I really like her, and she's a friend, and she invited me to go talk recently. I told her that story. But the key is, it's not does this dose work, right? It's does this drug work, and if so, what is the right dose to use? So anyway, so I think it's always okay to push questions, right? It's not our job as statisticians or generally as scientists to answer the questions people come to us with. It's our job to help formulate what is the right research question. Okay, so here we will answer a simplified question, I think, for this example. What is the maximally effective dose? And we'll consider placebo plus 6 doses. So a basic design may be to start with a fixed design where we put 40 patients on each of these 6 doses plus placebo. Many places would do a smaller number, but we'll look over this big range. But there are many things we should think about. Are we using the right number of doses? Should we use more? Should we use less? We don't need to start randomizing to all these doses at once, and we'll look at options in the end. Maybe we start with a low dose and just a high dose. One of the first trials I designed with Mike Krantz, who was here last night, was for uterine fibroids. So I guess there's no medical therapy for uterine fibroids that maintains fertility in women. And so they actually weren't very optimistic about their drug, but if the drug worked, it would be a very good option to offer women. So in it, we started randomizing only to placebo and the high dose. Even if the high dose worked for its goal, it may come with tolerability and other issues. So but the idea was look for efficacy in the extremes, and then if that worked, open up other doses and start exploring. And think about endpoints. We heard talks on endpoints today. There's something for MRS that I think works well sometimes, the sliding dichotomous scale. So if someone with a mild stroke, maybe giving them a therapy in there at 2 isn't that big a deal because they're kind of at 2 when they have their stroke. So ending as a 2 isn't good. Maybe someone with a mild stroke, you want to see them be a 0 in 90 days. And someone with a big stroke, being a 3 or a 4 at the end is still a success. That would illustrate improvement. When to measure endpoints is really important. Can we measure it in 30 days? Do we need a longer term outcome? Sometimes topics like that are dictated by FDA if it's for approval. Nevertheless, sometimes in phase 2, FDA may want, say, a 90-day endpoint, or in cancer, they may want an overall survival improvement. But in phase 2, people use shorter endpoints to get answers soon, which comes with risk. So we can end up bullying ourselves in phase 2. Mike Crane's talked last night about the ability to incorporate longitudinal models. So those are more advanced topics, but maybe things to keep in mind. And then we have to choose, what does success mean in phase 2? And we'll show that. I think Valerie's going to talk about some utility things next. Where we're going to look at dose response curves. And then we have to think about the population. I think one of the big risks is that we think accrual is good. The faster we can accrue the better. But the risk we run is accruing patients in whom there's not a benefit. So in the TPA trials, obviously, the first trials accrued a large number of patients for whom the treatment offered no benefit, and they were failed trials. There may also be limits on initial stroke severity. If it's a patient with a mild stroke, the drug may not help too much. If it's a patient with a huge stroke, nothing may help those patients. There may only be, kind of this middle group who a particular therapy offers benefits. Can we think about that up front, or maybe can we learn that as we go? If we don't know that up front, maybe instead of having a phase 2 trial that runs, that fails, we analyze the data post hoc and then run another one, maybe we can incorporate methods in there that attempts, anyway, to learn into a treatment works in the trial running. And then success criteria. Really in phase 2, the goal is to learn as much as we can to design an appropriate phase 3 trial. So I think the best phase 2 trial is one that maximizes the chance of success in phase 3, or correctly identifies that we shouldn't even go to phase 3. And I would argue, this is a little bit oversimplified, but if your phase 3 trial fails and was well powered and had sufficient resources, your phase 2 trial, even if when we publish a phase 2 trial, it's a success, if the next trial fails, something was wrong in phase 2. If you have 90% power, there's always a 10% chance that it might fail. But, if this happens, there may be something we didn't do right, identify the population, really identify the best dose, et cetera. So what looks like a successful phase 2 trial, right? It ends up in JAMA or New England Journal. Still, unless it leads us to success in phase 3, something was suboptimal. And discerning the difference between placebo and even a best dose can be a challenge. So when we think about phase 2 and we're really trying to compare adjacent doses, that's an even smaller difference. So this can be even harder than a phase 3 trial. And then there's many ways we can think about choosing. What is our success criteria? Sometimes we've done this, and it's just thinking about the predicted probability of a phase 3 trial. But it's not even what is the difference here. But given what effect we're observing, what is the probability I would say a 400 patient trial in phase 3? We can think about whether the dose is the MED, the ED90, whether the dose is better than controlled by some amount. If we can beat control, maybe that's not enough. Maybe we need to beat control by an average of 1 MRS, or by a response rate of 15%, something like that. That there's no benefit in enrolling a big trial that finds a really small difference. And then I think at the bottom, we don't do this too often in a way. The original ESET design did this, and then we got some feedback from FDA and had to change this a little bit. But the original endpoint in the ESET trial was a combination of, the seizure stops, the seizure stays stopped, and there's no big adverse event like bradycardia. So it was a composite endpoint. It was effectively a utility endpoint that I think in phase 2, that could be a really good idea if you have endpoints that will incorporate both efficacy and safety. Anyway, here for illustration purposes, we'll choose something relatively simple. We just have our response rate where your MRS is 0, 1, or 2. And we'll calculate the probability of the response rate on the best dose that we're measuring is greater than the response rate on placebo if that's bigger than 97.5%. But again, we have 6 doses here, right? So I'm going to make a multiplicity adjustment. Michelle's going to talk more about the idea of multiplicities tomorrow. But I'm going to compare that to 99.2 since we have a bunch of doses that we're each comparing to placebo. So this is an amazing way. It doesn't really matter as frequently as we see about the same thing. You can think of doing the same here for p-value between 0.5 versus maybe that. And Chris said something this morning about this too, right? That we don't want to see this power in one scenario. We really want to know over a range of possibilities. We may think we know how this is going to work, but we're usually wrong. So when we think about a trial, we really want that trial to run in all scenarios. Like when Boeing designs an airplane, we don't want that airplane just to fly like in beautiful blue skies, right? We want that airplane to fly, even in very stressful situations that it wasn't even designed for, right? In all circumstances, I want that airplane to work how it's supposed to work. So here, let's think about how this trial works, in a situation, say, where the drug doesn't work at all. The response rate is 20% across doses. What if the drug, or it actually gets worse? That this actually causes harm and makes patients worse after their strokes. So as dose goes up, response rates go down. If there's a very marginal benefit, the patients are only getting 8% better even by the highest dose. If they're getting 15% better, in this case, we see up to 15% at 25, and then it kind of levels out at 40. And then we have situations in which, so that there's a U shape where it maximizes at a 40% response rate at 25 and goes back down. And then the last one on the far right is best even at a low dose of 5, it goes back in. So instead of saying, here's what I believe to be true and here's my trial that works, if my one single guess works, let's show a trial that actually works in a variety of circumstances. If we knew that much, if we knew one of these was actually true, we wouldn't really need to run a phase 2 trial. Right? So if we do that, so in each of these circumstances across the top, in each of these scenarios, we'll look at how our trial does. So the probability of success in each of these, and this is the best dose in each one of these. Like actually getting nothing is better than one milligram, but that's the best of these doses. The probability of trial success, that it hits that 99.2% posterior, and the probability you choose the best dose. So some of those doses, like I said, are really close together. So it may be hard to discern which one of those doses is the best. So for instance, here, due to random variability, this one may look better than this one. So we're not going to always choose 35%, even if that's statistically significant. So for instance, for the CSD, there's only a 29% chance of success with just 280 patients. And if I just look at the best dose, it may not even be statistically significant. But the best dose, there's only a 39% chance I choose that single dose that is the best. But can we do better than this? So here it assumes each of those doses are independent. Each of those 7 doses are independent. And that's how historically a lot of people pick trials like this. And it's the reason that people tend only to use, say, 2 or 3 doses. But if doses are really close together and effectively the same dose, maybe we can share information across those doses to improve some of our estimates. So we can think about a dose response model. So there's many different model choices like logistic, Emacs models. Here, say we don't know that this is going to be a monotonic relationship. Many dose response models assume a monotonic relationship. So I'm going to choose something called a normal dynamic linear model. I know some groups are using this in here. But this allows us to share the information between adjacent doses, but also allows maybe these U-shaped curves so that if one dose is better, but then even more drug allows base patients have an even lower response rate. But the key is now I get to share information between doses if 2 adjacent doses are looking similar. And when I do that, we can see how power increases. For instance, in the CSD case, power goes from 29% to 42%. Big jumps from positive to 52% to 69%. It's still really hard, though, to discern which of competing doses are doing the best. Yeah, so this is the case, like if we look at positive, still only 40% of the time we're choosing the absolute right dose, even though we're getting a significant result nearly 70% of the time. And it's because these doses are really close, right? Ideally, we're choosing the lower of equal doses, but these doses are still close. So what else can we do that might maybe improve this? Well, we can think about response adaptive allocation. So this is the idea of, when we say getting hot, keep going in the direction we're going, keep exploring where it looks like the action. So now instead of equally allocating patients to these 7 doses, you're putting 40 patients on each of these 7 doses, really 6 active doses plus placebo. Maybe start with some burn-in, like 10 patients per dose. And for the first 70 patients, spread them out evenly and then try to learn and focus where patients are doing better. So here then for the next 210 patients, we would try to allocate where patients are doing better. In this example, I use this 8 patients at a time. So in the next 8 patients, I'm always going to put 2 on placebo, and the other 6 randomized to those that seem to be doing the best. Look at the data again. And while doing this, we need to think about accrual rate, obviously. This is 90 patients, or sorry, a 90-day outcome in this situation. So there's always some information lacking. So if accrual is really fast, if somehow we could enroll all 280 patients in 90 days, we couldn't do this, right? Because we'd enroll everyone before we knew anything. That's almost never the case in clinical trials, that we start seeing information as other patients accrue. Historically, clinical trials weren't made to do this, but we have infrastructure that allows this to be possible, right? Like I can go on my phone right now this instant and see like badminton scores from the Brazil Olympics right now. So if we live in a world where I can see real-time badminton scores on my phone in my pocket, then there's no reason when a patient comes to an office visit at 90 days in Boston, that's not going to a database, in Charleston, so that when the next patient is randomized somewhere, we can use that information.
So the question about the sort of concern about multiple comparisons. Do we need to correct our p-values for multiple comparisons if we keep repeating these analyses all the time?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I do that here because we have multiple doses. In this case, there's no stopping early for success, so we need to think about when we're doing interims. In this case, we're doing interims and changing randomization probabilities, but we're not allowing for early stopping at any time. So if we're, and I'm going to talk about that in a little later slide, if every time I update randomization probabilities, I also ask, do I know my answer? Do I know what a best dose is? That's another multiplicity adjustment we have to do. No. And it's a very important question when we start this, right? Like there's the old adage, you never get a second chance to make the first impression. So if we did this particularly early, it's possible that a dose that looks really good, just due to random variability, may look bad for the first 10 patients. And if we do that, we may never go back to it. So for instance, the ESET trial is about 800 patients maximum. There's 3 drugs, and we put 100 patients on each drug. And then we started actively randomizing. And we had one big meeting where we thought, we start this at 200, at 300, at 400 patients. And you're going to get, some things better. You're going to get more patients on better drugs on average by having a shorter burn-in, turning on adaptive randomization faster. But there's also going to be more times on occasion where, a dose just looks bad and you never go back to it. With the dose response model, that attenuates the sum and why we can do a burn-in of 70 patients here. ESET is just 3 totally different drugs, so there's no dose response model. We don't learn anything about one treatment for what we see on the other, so we had to wait a little bit longer in that case. So here we'll do this, we'll enroll 70 patients, look at the data, and every 8 patients thereafter update randomization probabilities. And we can look at our familiar table again, we see huge benefits now. So dose response modeling increased power by 17%, we get another 9% benefit by adaptive randomization. Right, and this makes sense, like at the end of the college football season, we don't have Michigan, and Michigan is undefeated, play, or against Louisiana State. If we have Michigan play USC, if USC is undefeated. So at the end of the trial, if my 50 and 100 milligram doses are looking the best, let's put all the patients only on 50 and 100 milligrams. That's where the 2 things are looking really equal. We're going to get the most efficient information is just by focusing patients there. Obviously, it does those patients well too. But at the end of the trial, I'm still putting patients on 5. I'm not learning anything about the real difference I care about, the difference between the 2 best. And we can see here when we do that. So this shows the table I showed before with the actual benefits here, and then the average number of patients. So in a fixed trial, every dose got 40. So in this, say, inverse U related case, so we have 35, 40, and 35 is the truth. We're putting a few more patients up here. Now it's 46, but I'm putting fewer patients down here. I have 27 fewer patients on this ineffective dose, and I'm putting more patients on the best dose and more patients on the dose right beside the best dose. So you can see how we're taking patients away from doses that don't work and applying them to ones that do. So I've highlighted here always the cases that are the best in each row, With fixed randomization, we have 40 patients, so we can see how we're always getting more patients on the best dose. Another added benefit is that if this is the dose we choose to go forward with phase 3 with, we have 50% more information about safety on all these doses too. So not only is it more statistically efficient to learn about the individual case for efficacy, we're getting more safety information, more tolerability information on the doses we're going to be giving. Questions on that? Yes?
So is this all assuming that you have some sort of surrogate marker for efficacy? Is that where you're basing?
Right, so here I don't assume any sort of longitudinal model or anything like that. I assume that there's a 90-day outcome. So for instance, when I'm running this, any patient who was enrolled in the last 90 days, I don't know anything about. So that, and I'm always accounting for that. So I think one of the things I have on the last slide is that we want to vary accrual rate. If accrual goes really fast, we have more patients enrolled who I don't know anything about, and my numbers aren't going to look as good. If accrual slows down even beyond what I assume here, these numbers get even better. In the ESET trial, we know the answer to everyone in really a few hours, because it's, does your seizure stop, does your seizure stay stopped? So we within a day, we know everyone knows. It's still up to study coordinators to put that data in, but they know to do that. But there are times where someone may call and say, I have a 2-year outcome, which is sometimes the case like spinal implants, where it's really hard to use these methods that they can enroll in. Like diabetes trial, super easy to enroll diabetics in big trials, and a lot of times they're not really good at it. But yeah, it's always important to think about where's my endpoint value and how fast I can do it.
Perhaps if you have a drug that you don't know the pharmacokinetics of, let's say it changes with weight,
Okay.
and you do this, would it show that there's something the pharmacokinetics is changing, or not really?
So I am not a PK/PD guy. I think a lot of times by the time I get involved for phase 2, people understand PK/PD better and know whether it's straight dosing, whether it's dosing by weight, things like that. Does anybody else have a good answer here? Because I think that question would apply to fixed phase 2 trial as well as anything like I'm showing. Does anyone know PK/PD better? But I think you could probably try to model that curve, say by scaling by weight and just by dose, and maybe see if you get a better model fit between each of those 2 ways, and that may inform that. But that's a naive answer to someone who doesn't know anything. Other questions? Okay, and there's just another case where we see 40 is the best, and we're putting more patients on that and more patients on the dose we decided, and very few instead of 40 patients, 40 to 15 patients on those really high doses that really aren't very effective. And so I didn't incorporate early stopping where we had the question about multiplicity. So when I started dating my wife, I didn't say based upon my former relations and romantic experiences that in 9 months I will probably know whether she's the one or not. And in 9 months from then, I call my mom and say, okay, here's all the data. I need to make a go-no good. But that's kind of what we do in phase 2 trials a lot of times. Versus instead of, as we go, repeatedly asking ourselves, okay, do we have enough information to go forward for phase 3? So a lot of times we have this one decision point. There's no reason why we have to do that, though I think it is fair and appropriate to account for that multiplicity. The more times we ask ourselves, is this enough data? Maybe we should raise that bar high. Maybe we had that trip where you go to the family reunion and she eats crazy Uncle Frank and she doesn't run. And you think, wow, I better put a ring on this while she's, So, it's also good to wait through the weekend and make sure you're, anyway. And I would say a last point here, so you need to account for multiplicity. That's a very good earlier question. And when we stop enrollment, because of the way we're working, there's always patients on the horizon. Someone else asked that question. Then we would stop enrollment, say, for predicted success, but wait for all those patients to come in, and then make our final decision once we have complete information. Did I see it in the room? So adaptations only work, this is one of those questions, really if we have enough information to work. So time to information is extremely important. That we can't adapt and control is really fast relative to time to information. and that we really should vary this. See, like any assumptions that we make in the design of a trial, we should see how sensitive our design is to those assumptions. So we should vary accrual rate and see how sensitive that is. And this certainly requires more planning and more involved infrastructure, though we certainly live in a world where the infrastructure is relatively easy. It's not always there, but it's relatively easy to build these days. But it definitely requires more planning. And I realize as much of the funding mechanism here is NIH that it's harder because you need time to do this. We've been very lucky, like Annie said, that we effectively had a planning grant with the adaptive study, but that's always hard to do. But like Mike said last night, you really can't think hard enough about it, right? Like there was a ton of thought about going to the moon, and we didn't just say, let's try this and have a lot of astronauts not make it up or make it back. But there was a ton of thought put into it. If we're going to spend $30 million on a trial, or even $3 million on a trial, it's really worth spending $30,000 thinking really hard and simulating the heck out of how that trial might work. So I think I kind of just said that in summary, but it's important to think about, what do we really want to know? What do we really need for the next trial to be successful? This is something I learned from Roger and others. I think Roger calls it anticipated regret, and I've heard it called prospective postmortem. So it's a good idea to have your design team sitting around and think, okay, we have a design in front of us. This is how we really think this would work. And incorporate, study coordinators who really know when things go wrong, like what's making this go wrong. And I, as a statistician, don't know. Even Will, as a great doctor as he is, doesn't always see how things exactly happen. Say, okay, 3 years from now, this trial failed. What might go wrong to make it fail? It might be the example last night where they were looking for like a difference of 2 in this endpoint, but the inter-rater agreement was way beyond 2. So they were looking for a signal much smaller than the noise just in the endpoint, which was way smaller than the difference in the actual drug effect. So think about what can go wrong. Think, TPM only works if I get it fast, or it only works in a certain patient population. The effect is really more weight-based than just dose based. Think what can go wrong, and ideally, maybe we can incorporate an adaptation or 2, probably not more than that, but so that we can learn as we go and build in those mild corrections to the lower. I think that's it. Thank you.
You started late and you finished 6 minutes early. Only all clinical trials are like that. All right, any questions?
Yeah, Carmen.
Can you say a little bit more about when you have a number of different variables that you want to vary in your adaptive design? So if you want to vary dose and duration and combination with another drug, you mentioned that you could do that, but then how do you approach what to vary in each step? Is there an algorithm for that?
I think the short answer is not really. So sometimes I think about, you go to the optometrist and like, well, you like this one or this one, and you say, wait, you're going to go this one or this one. So that's how we change this law, because it's hard to search that whole space, right? So we may search how can we incorporate changing dose, how can we incorporate changing duration. And in cancer, we've done a lot of trials like that where we think about duration and then frequency, like is it better to give you twice as much once every 2 weeks, because you're having to go to the doctor to get medicine, or we have to give you half as much every week, which maybe that works better, but it's twice as laborious for a patient, right? I think more than 2 things gets really hard and gets complicated because you're searching over such a big space that, we had the burn-in here where we put 10 patients on each of those 7 doses. If you really don't know what's going on yet, it's hard to put, enough patients kind of over the whole space. Ideally, maybe you can try and fill in between. You don't have to start looking at every possible thing we may go to, like the thyroid trial I mentioned with Mike Grams. We started on 2 doses just to see what the high would have filled in as we went. But I think sometimes it's hard to convince people it's okay to do adaptations, but once they're convinced, they're like, yeah, let's search everywhere. Then you got to rein them in, right? So I think it just gets unwieldy, and it's much harder to understand if you're looking over too many dimensions. So I think if you're looking over that many dimensions, you're probably not ready to do the next phase trial yet anyway.
Okay. I think I missed that. So the burn-in phase with like that 70 patients, you're kind of varying a couple of things at that point.
Right. Where was that one? Yeah, once I incorporated response adaptive allocation, so that it starts by just putting 10 patients on each of the 7 doses.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Oh, 10 patients per dose, I get it.
Right, right. Yeah, and we won't know, and I forget what accrual rate we use in this one, but we won't know all 70 patients, right? In the 90-day outcome, we may only have information on 40 of those patients when we start going. So it's not 70 patients with information, it's 70 patients enrolled, and then the day I'm ready to enroll the 71st patient, I do an analysis, learn from that. And that's why, like I said, in ESEP, we thought long and hard that the burden is 300 patients, 100 on each of the 3 epileptic drugs. But we thought long and hard that we started at 200, then we started at 300, then we started at 400.
And I think the broader question of how do you prioritize adaptations, there's no quantitative rule for that. That involves the clinicians sort of meeting, talking, perhaps bringing in basic science data if it's available. And I think if you're interested in duration, I think if you don't give your drug long enough, you would feel bad and you'd never know that it wasn't going to work. Like a study where, well, we'll give it for 3 days because stroke patients are in the hospital for 3 days. But from all the basic science data says you need to give it for 7 days to maximize the amount of recovery the animal will have. If you pick 3 days, your trial is likely to fail. One approach, if you think that 3 days is going to be infeasible later, is to start your trial at 7 days. If 7 days is looking good, maybe some people go down to 5 after you found the dose that seems to have the most effect. And then if 5 still looks good, then you maybe go down to 3, because people aren't just like big rats, although the Pokemon characters kind of look that way. That is sort of this whole process of like, what are the things that prospective postmortem, what are the things that you're going to reject or regret the most at the end of the trial? You'll never know that, this is one thing that it's hard to get back from, because if you needed to give your agent for 7 days, but you, for whatever reason, decided to give it for 3 days, you're never going to know that because you did the 3-day duration trial, and you'll just feel really sad because your 3-day trial was neutral. So I think you can't have an adaptive design or a flexible design. It's not magic. So there is some limit to what you can put on it, and for people like Jason or Valerie will tell you when you've gone to the limits. I always try to push the limits.
No, and I think sometimes it's good to, we've all had collaborators that really want to do